In a world of empires, where kings ruled by divine right and emperors sat on golden thrones, an ancient idea was born quietly, dangerously, and forever. An idea that power should not belong to the few, but to the many. That ordinary people, not just the nobles, not just the rich, should have a voice. This is the story of that idea. From the shouting assemblies of ancient Athens to the quiet ballots cast in modern republics, from tribal councils under the stars to the digital debates on our screens, democracy has lived many lives. And it is still evolving. But where did it begin? What did it survive? And where is it heading now? Welcome to our deep dive into the story of democracy, its origins, struggles, revolutions, and rebirths. Before we begin, a quick favor. If you believe the world needs more awareness about the power of people and the fragile gift of freedom, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapter of this powerful journey through history. We also want to hear from you. Do you think democracy is stronger today than ever before? Or do you feel it's under threat? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, just like the voices of those who fought for democracy centuries ago. Part 1. The Birth of Democracy. 1. Before democracy had a name, tribal roots and early governance. Long before democracy was ever written into constitutions or etched into marble halls, its spirit lived in the tribal firesides of prehistory. Among hunter-gatherer societies scattered across the continents, from the plains of Africa to the forests of Europe and the valleys of Asia, early humans often made decisions collectively. Elders or shamans may have held influence, but consensus was frequently sought. In these small, kin-based groups, there existed the rudimentary elements of democratic practice: discussion, mutual respect, and collective decision-making. In many indigenous cultures, important choices, such as when to migrate, how to divide food, or whether to go to war, were made after communal debate. Authority was often decentralized. These early systems weren't called democracies, nor were they always peaceful, but they contained a principle that would echo across millennia: the idea that power could arise from the collective will, not just a single ruler. As humans settled into agricultural communities and larger city-states began to emerge, such as those in Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, and China, hierarchical rule tended to replace communal governance. Kings, priests, and warrior elites centralized authority. Still, whispers of participation remained. City assemblies, councils of elders, and citizen juries would reappear in different ways across civilizations, culminating in the first true democratic experiment in ancient Greece. 2. Athens, the cradle of democracy. No city in history is more associated with the birth of democracy than Athens. In the 5th century BCE, amid the marble temples and olive groves of this proud Greek polis, a radical political innovation took root: democratia, or rule by the people. But Athenian democracy did not appear fully formed. It evolved through tension, reform, and sometimes violence. The Greek polis, or city-state, was a unique political organism. Unlike the sprawling empires of Egypt or Persia, Greek city-states were relatively small and fiercely independent. In Athens, as population grew and trade expanded, social unrest simmered. The aristocrats controlled land and wealth, while the poor fell into debt and servitude. The gap widened until the city teetered on civil war. Enter Solon, a reformer appointed in 594 BCE to heal the rift. He canceled debts, banned debt slavery, and reorganized political power not by birth, but by wealth-creating 4 property classes. While not fully democratic, Solon's reforms opened the door to broader participation and restructured the Athenian political system. The next leap came with Cleisthenes, known as the father of Athenian democracy. In 508 BCE, after a period of tyranny and civil strife, Cleisthenes introduced reforms that fundamentally altered Athenian society. He reorganized citizens into 10 tribes based on residence rather than family, diluting aristocratic power. More importantly, he created the Council of 500, selected by lot, to prepare legislation for the assembly. The assembly became the heart of Athenian democracy. Every male citizen over 18 had the right to speak and vote. They debated war, passed laws, approved budgets, and held leaders accountable. Officials were chosen by lottery or election, and most served for a limited time. There were safeguards too. Ostracism, for example, allowed citizens to exile a dangerous figure by popular vote. For a brief moment in history, the radical idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves took root and flourished. But Athenian democracy had deep flaws. Women, slaves, and medics were excluded from political life, meaning that only about 10 to 20% of the population had any political rights. Moreover, the reliance on direct democracy was only practical in a relatively small city-state. Decisions were sometimes swayed by demagogues who manipulated public opinion. Even so, the Athenian model remains one of history's most remarkable political experiments, a society in which the poor and rich could both serve as magistrates, where ordinary citizens judged trials and ran the city, and where political participation was seen not as a burden, but a civic duty. 3. Sparta, order without freedom. While Athens represented radical democracy, Sparta stood as its authoritarian counterpoint. The militarized society of Sparta had its own unique governance, a mixed system combining monarchy, oligarchy, and elements of representation. The Spartan assembly existed, but had limited power. Most authority rested with the Gerousia and ephors. Spartan democracy was minimal, and political equality was restricted to a narrow elite of male, land-owning warriors. Yet some later thinkers, such as Plato, admired its order and discipline more than Athenian chaos. Sparta serves as an early example of how societies can share some democratic forms, but not its spirit or inclusivity. 4. Rome, the Republic and the rise of representation. If Athens introduced direct democracy, Rome developed its representative counterpart. Founded, according to legend, in 509 BC, after the overthrow of the last Roman king, the Roman Republic created a complex system of checks and balances designed to prevent tyranny. The Republic was governed by elected officials, most famously, the consul's 2 leaders who shared executive power. Laws were passed by citizen assemblies, and lifelong senators advised on matters of war, finance, and policy. Over time, Rome developed a balance between aristocratic control and popular influence. The conflict of the orders, a centuries-long struggle between the elite patricians and the common plebeians, led to gradual reforms. The tribunes of the plebs were established to represent the interests of the lower classes, and the 12 tables codified Roman law, making it harder for elites to manipulate legal processes in secret. Though not democratic in the Athenian sense, the Roman Republic pioneered key features of modern representative democracy: elections, term limits, bicameralism, rule of law. But like Athens, Rome's democracy was incomplete. Women, slaves, and non-citizens had no voice. Power increasingly fell into the hands of the wealthy, and eventually, ambitious generals like Julius Caesar would dismantle the Republic in favor of imperial autocracy. 5. Beyond Greece and Rome, forgotten democratic traditions. While Athens and Rome are the most celebrated, other ancient societies experimented with democratic principles. In ancient India, certain states like the Lycabas and Shakyas were governed by Gana Sanghas Republican assemblies where decisions were made collectively by elders or clan leaders. While limited in scale and scope, they reflected traditions of shared power and mutual consensus. Even in autocratic empires like Sumer and Babylon, historical records show that assemblies of elders and free men played roles in legal and military decisions. Kings often sought approval, or at least ceremonial consensus for wars or successions. These institutions were usually advisory, but they hint at proto-democratic elements in ancient autocracies. 6. Democracy's first death. By the 1st century BCE, both Athens and the Roman Republic had collapsed into autocracy. The rise of Macedonian kings, then Roman emperors, and finally, Byzantine and European monarchies extinguished democracy as a living political system. But it was not forgotten. Philosophers and historians, like Aristotle and Polybius, recorded democratic ideas. These texts would survive, buried in libraries and monasteries, ready to be rediscovered centuries later. For a time, democracy became a whisper in the corridors of memory, waiting to be reborn in a new age. The ancient world planted the seeds of democracy. In Athens, it burst into life direct, noisy, imperfect, and revolutionary. In Rome, it morphed into a republic built on law and representation. These early experiments revealed both the power and fragility of giving citizens a voice. As empires rose and fell, the democratic flame flickered, but it never fully died. In the next chapter of this journey, we will see how, amid the shadows of medieval Europe and theocratic empires, democracy would hibernate, incubate, and eventually begin its slow and miraculous return. Part 2. Democracy in the Shadows. 1. The collapse of classical democracy. With the fall of the Roman Republic and the transformation of Athens into a vassal of empires, democracy as a functioning political system vanished from the world stage. The Roman Empire, Byzantine rule, and later Islamic caliphates maintained certain civic institutions and legal systems, but centralized, hierarchical authority became the norm. The idea that ordinary citizens should rule themselves was cast aside in favor of monarchies, emperors, and divine right. In Europe, the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE plunged much of the continent into what historians call the Dark Ages. Feudalism emerged as the dominant political order, characterized by rigid class structures, hereditary titles, and decentralized rule by nobles and kings. But even in this era of shadow and stagnation, the seed of democracy never truly died. It lay dormant, protected, adapted, or reinvented in surprising places. 2. Feudalism and the absence of democratic power. Feudal Europe was built on bonds of loyalty between lords and vassals. Kings ruled with the help of nobles, who controlled land and extracted labor and taxes from peasants. There was little room for individual rights or participatory governance. The majority of the population serfs were bound to the land with no legal or political agency. However, even within this rigid system, collective decision-making persisted in local traditions. In villages, local customs were upheld by councils of elders. In monastic communities, abbots were often elected by monks. In cities, especially as they grew wealthier, guilds and merchant councils began asserting local autonomy. These were not democracies in the Athenian sense, but they reflected a return of participatory governance within limited domains. 3. The Icelandic Althing, democracy on the edge of the world. One of the most remarkable democratic institutions of the medieval period arose not in a grand city, but on a volcanic island in the North Atlantic. In 930 CE, settlers in Iceland, mainly Norse and Celtic exiles, created the Althing, a national assembly that convened once a year at Thingvellir. There, chieftains, known as Gogr, would meet to make laws and settle disputes. While power was still concentrated among elites, decisions were made collectively, and free men could attend and voice their concerns. The Althing represented a rare and resilient form of participatory governance in an era dominated by kings and emperors. Remarkably, it continues today as the world's oldest surviving parliament. 4. The Swiss cantons, liberty in the mountains. In the high valleys of the Swiss Alps, another unique democratic tradition emerged. As early as the 13th century, small communities in what is now Switzerland formed alliances to resist domination by feudal lords and foreign empires. These communities or cantons practiced direct democracy, where citizens would gather in open-air assemblies called Landgemeinde to vote on laws, elect leaders, and debate taxes. The Swiss Confederacy, formalized in 1291, began as a military and political alliance among 3 cantons. Over time, more cantons joined, and the tradition of local autonomy and consensus-based decision-making became central to Swiss political identity. Here, in the remote mountain passes of medieval Europe, democracy quietly endured, sustained by necessity and collective will. 5. The Magna Carta, noble privileges and the first limits on kings. In 1215, a crisis erupted in England. King John, weakened by military defeats and desperate for funds, faced a rebellion from his barons. The result was the Magna Carta, a document signed at Runnymede that would go on to inspire centuries of democratic development. The Magna Carta did not establish democracy. It was a peace treaty between elites, securing feudal rights against the king's overreach. Yet, it introduced several revolutionary ideas. The king is not above the law. No taxation without representation. Right to a fair trial. Clause by clause, it laid the foundation for constitutional governance. Over time, it inspired the creation of Parliament, a body initially composed of nobles and clergy, but eventually expanded to include elected commoners. The English Parliament, through centuries of struggle and reform, would become the progenitor of modern legislative democracy. 6. The Church, paradox of authority and participation. The Catholic Church, with its hierarchical and often autocratic structure, may seem an unlikely source of democratic influence. Yet within its walls, there were sparks of elective governance. Bishops were sometimes elected by local clergy and laypeople. Monastic orders, especially the Benedictines and later the Franciscans, practiced communal rule and elected their leaders. The papacy itself was determined through a conclave of cardinals, a voting process that survives to this day. Moreover, theological debates within the Church would later influence the emergence of rights-based thought. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and later William of Ockham argued that human beings had natural rights, granted by God ideas that would resurface in Enlightenment political theory. 7. The Italian city-states, Renaissance republics. During the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, a handful of Italian city-states broke away from feudal structures to become commercial republics. Cities like Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Siena developed elaborate political systems based on councils, guild representation, and citizen participation. Venice developed a mixed government. The Doge, or chief magistrate, was elected for life. A complex system of councils ensured that no single group could dominate. Political offices rotated frequently, preventing dynasties. Florence, home of the Medici family and the Renaissance, experienced periods of republican rule where guilds and artisans held significant political sway through elected councils and the signoria. Although these republics often devolved into oligarchies or were dominated by powerful families, they preserved and experimented with ancient models of civic participation. 8. Indigenous democratic traditions. The Iroquois Confederacy. While Europe wrestled with feudalism and monarchy, indigenous societies elsewhere were developing sophisticated forms of participatory governance. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, formed in what is now New York and Canada, united 5 nations under a great law of peace, a constitution that outlined the responsibilities of chiefs, councils, and clans. Key features included consensus decision-making, checks and balances between clans and tribes, removal of corrupt leaders by women elders, deliberative councils for common affairs. Many scholars believe that the Iroquois Confederacy influenced early American political thinkers, including Benjamin Franklin, as they considered models for self-governance. 9. The burghers and the rise of the bourgeoisie. In late medieval Europe, especially in the Low Countries and the German-speaking lands, urban merchants and craftsmen began to wield economic and political power. These burghers, or town dwellers, formed councils to govern trade, resolve disputes, and defend city rights. Over time, some cities gained charters that allowed them to operate with near-total independence from feudal overlords. Guilds, professional associations of artisans and merchants, became important centers of political life. They were self-regulating and democratic within their ranks, electing officers and enforcing ethical standards. This rising middle class, or bourgeoisie, would later become a driving force behind democratic revolutions in the modern era. 10. Democracy's hibernation nears its end. By the late 15th century, the world was beginning to change. The printing press spread new ideas. The Protestant Reformation challenged religious hierarchies. The age of exploration opened new lands and new questions about governance, sovereignty, and human rights. Though the medieval period is often remembered as the age of kings, knights, and popes, it also preserved and reinvented democratic practices in subtle ways. In icy assemblies, guild halls, church councils, and mountain valleys, democracy survived its long winter. In the next chapter, we witness the moment when that hibernation ends, the Enlightenment dawns. Revolution stirs in the minds of philosophers and the hearts of colonists. And the world begins to ask, once again, should the people rule themselves? Part 3. Enlightenment and Revolution. 1. The Age of Ideas. Seeds of a political earthquake. By the 17th and 18th centuries, the medieval world had begun to crack. Monarchs still ruled with iron fists, but new ideas were stirring in salons, coffee houses, and university halls. The scientific revolution had challenged dogma. The printing press had spread ideas. And the Enlightenment, an intellectual movement championing reason, liberty, and individual rights, was about to transform the very idea of government. In this period, thinkers like John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire laid the philosophical foundations for modern democracy. The English philosopher John Locke argued that all people possess certain natural rights, life, liberty, and property. Government, he said, exists not by divine will, but by the consent of the governed. If a ruler violates these rights, the people have not just the right, but the duty to overthrow them. His revolutionary ideas, written in the late 1600s, would echo loudly across the Atlantic a century later. Baron de Montesquieu, writing in 18th century France, introduced a concept that is now central to all democratic systems: the separation of powers. He argued that to prevent tyranny, government should be divided into 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial, each acting as a check on the others. His book, The Spirit of the Laws, would become a blueprint for constitutional democracies around the world. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, more radical than Locke or Montesquieu, declared that sovereignty lies with the people alone. He believed in the concept of the general will, collective moral compass that governments must follow. To Rousseau, true democracy meant active participation by all citizens, not just representation. 2. The American Revolution. Democracy reborn in a new world. Across the Atlantic, the 13 British colonies in North America found themselves increasingly at odds with their distant king. Taxes without representation, laws passed without input, soldiers stationed without consent. The colonists declared independence in 1776, guided by Enlightenment principles and Locke's theories. The Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson, announced to the world that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This was not just a political break, it was a philosophical revolution. After winning independence, the new United States faced the monumental task of building a government. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia and drafted the U.S. Constitution. a document establishing a federal republic with checks and balances, an elected legislature, an executive president, and an independent judiciary. The Bill of Rights followed soon after, enshrining freedoms like speech, press, religion, and due process. Yet it was far from a perfect democracy. Women could not vote. Enslaved people were denied humanity. Only property-owning white men had full political rights. Still, it was a radical departure from monarchy, and it inspired revolutions worldwide. 3. The French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity. Just a few years after the American Revolution, another democratic upheaval erupted, this time in the heart of Europe. In 1789, facing economic collapse, famine, and aristocratic excess, the French people rose up against their monarchy. The storming of the Bastille, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the abolition of feudal privileges all signaled the birth of a new political era. The French Revolution introduced universal male suffrage, abolished hereditary titles, and proclaimed the sovereignty of the people. But it also descended into violence and chaos. The Reign of Terror saw thousands guillotined, and ultimately, the revolution gave way to Napoleon's dictatorship. Despite its contradictions, the revolution's ideals, liberté, égalité, fraternité, became enduring symbols of democratic aspiration. 4. Other echoes of revolution. The spirit of democratic revolution spread like wildfire. Haiti. Enslaved Africans led the world's first successful slave revolt, establishing a free republic. Latin America. Leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin waged wars of independence against Spanish rule. Poland, Ireland, and Greece all saw uprisings inspired by Enlightenment ideals. These revolutions were rarely perfect and often suppressed. But the idea of democracy had escaped the philosopher's book and the town hall. It was now in the streets, on the battlefield, in the blood and breath of people across the globe. 5. The long road ahead. The Enlightenment and the Revolutionary period reawakened democracy, but the world would not embrace it all at once. The 19th century would see fierce battles between monarchists and republicans, oligarchs and reformers, colonizers, and the colonized. Yet the direction of history had shifted. The questions were no longer, should the people rule? But rather, which people? How should they rule? Can democracy survive its own contradictions? These are the questions we will explore in Part 4. Part 4. The spread of representative democracy. 1. The aftershocks of revolution. As the 19th century began, the world stood on a precipice. The democratic revolutions in America and France had shaken the foundations of monarchy and empire, but the dust had not yet settled. Some countries attempted to restore the old order. Kings reclaimed their thrones. Empires tightened their grip. And yet the idea of the people ruling themselves had taken root, and it would not go away. This century would be marked not by the sudden birth of democracy, but by its slow, uneven expansion, a battle fought in ballots and books, in parliaments and protests, in factories and fields. 2. The rise of constitutional monarchies. As revolutionary flames scorched Europe, some monarchies chose a different path, not to resist democracy entirely, but to coexist with it. Unlike France, Britain avoided violent revolution, instead slowly transforming its monarchy into a constitutional one. By the early 1800s, the British Parliament, especially the elected House of Commons, had begun asserting more power. But voting rights were still deeply limited. Only wealthy landowning men could vote. Cities like Manchester, despite booming populations, had no representation, while some rotten boroughs, with a handful of voters, elected members to Parliament. A series of Reform Acts gradually expanded the franchise. 1832 Reform Act eliminated rotten boroughs and gave representation to industrial towns. 1867 and 1884 Acts extended voting rights to more working-class men. 1918 and 1928 acts finally gave women the right to vote, first partially, then fully. By the 20th century, Britain had transformed into a full parliamentary democracy, with a ceremonial monarchy and a powerful elected legislature. Elsewhere in Europe, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark moved toward parliamentary systems with elected chambers. The Netherlands adopted a liberal constitution in 1848. Belgium, after gaining independence in 1830, became a constitutional monarchy with voting rights for property-owning men. Monarchs did not disappear, but they ceased to rule, becoming symbols rather than sovereigns. 3. The march toward universal suffrage. Perhaps the most transformative change of the 19th century was the gradual extension of voting rights, from the privileged few to the masses. Industrialization had reshaped societies. Masses of working-class people filled the cities, fueling economic growth, yet they remained politically voiceless. In Britain, this led to the Chartist movement, a working-class campaign demanding universal male suffrage, secret ballots, salaries for members of parliament, annual elections. Though many of their demands were rejected at the time, they laid the groundwork for future reform. In the United States, after independence, property requirements for voting were gradually lifted. By the mid-1800s, most white men could vote, though women, Native Americans, and Black Americans remained excluded or heavily disenfranchised. One of the greatest democratic movements of the century was led by those who had long been excluded from political life: women. The first organized women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. Led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, the attendees declared, "All men and women are created equal." The women's suffrage movement spread across Europe and the Americas. New Zealand became the first self-governing country to grant women the vote in 1893. Finland followed in 1906, allowing women both to vote and stand for office. Others would join slowly, through hard-fought campaigns that stretched into the 20th century. 4. The American Civil War and Reconstruction. In the United States, the contradiction at the heart of its democracy, slavery erupted into civil war in 1861. The Union victory in 1865 led to the abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, followed by the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection. The 15th Amendment, prohibiting voting discrimination based on race. In theory, this was a profound expansion of democracy. In practice, however, the Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, and violent intimidation disenfranchised Black Americans for nearly a century until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. 5. The idea of nationhood and self-determination. The 19th century also saw the rise of nationalism, the belief that people who share a language, culture, or history should govern themselves. This ideal often aligned with democratic goals. Across Europe and Latin America, colonies fought for independence. Ethnic groups demanded autonomy. Empires began to fracture. The concept of self-determination, later enshrined by Woodrow Wilson after WWI, became a rallying cry for democratic aspirations across the globe. 6. New models of governance, presidential and parliamentary. As democracies spread, different models emerged to answer a central question: how should the people govern themselves? Presidential system, separation of powers between executive, legislative, and judicial branches. President elected independently from the legislature. Fixed terms and strong individual leadership. This system emphasized checks and balances, but sometimes led to gridlock between branches. Parliamentary system. Prime Minister chosen from the majority party in Parliament. Executive and legislative branches intertwined. Flexible terms and majority rule. This system allowed for faster governance, but less separation of powers. Many democracies adopted hybrid models or adapted these systems to fit their cultures. 7. democracy and the colonized world. While democracy flourished in the West, most of the world remained under colonial domination. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, was ruled without democratic input from its 300+ million people. In Africa, European powers carved up the continent with no regard for indigenous governance. In Asia, countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines lived under imperial rule. Yet even in the colonies, democratic ideals circulated underground in newspapers, protest movements, and nationalist struggles that would erupt in the 20th century. 8. The democratic spirit spreads. By the end of the 19th century, voting rights had expanded dramatically across Europe and the Americas, though often still excluding women and minorities. Parliaments were growing in power. Political parties began to form, helping organize mass participation. The press and public opinion became major forces in shaping policy. Democracy was still fragile. It was still partial. But it was no longer a fringe idea. It was becoming a defining aspiration of the modern age. The 19th century did not perfect democracy. It complicated it, expanded it, and tested its foundations. It proved that democracy was not a gift handed down by monarchs or gods. It was a struggle, a movement, a demand shouted by workers, women, and colonized people across the world. And just as democracy seemed to be gaining strength, the 20th century would bring unprecedented crises: world wars, dictatorships, genocides, and ideological clashes that would threaten to erase everything the democratic world had built. But it would also see democracy's greatest victories. Part 5. Democracy under threat. 1. The fragile triumph of democracy. As the 20th century dawned, democracy appeared to be gaining momentum. In many parts of Europe and the Americas, parliaments were asserting authority, suffrage was expanding, and civil liberties were being written into law. But this progress was precarious. Beneath the surface, economic inequality, nationalist tensions, racial injustice, and political polarization festered. Democracy was not yet deeply rooted. It was still an experiment, vulnerable to both internal weakness and external shock. That shock came swiftly. In the span of just 3 decades, the world would endure 2 global wars, the rise of fascist and communist totalitarian regimes, the collapse of fledgling democracies, and a crisis of faith in liberal institutions. Democracy, so recently awakened, stood on the brink of obliteration. 2. World War I, the fall of empires and the myth of the war to end all wars. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered a chain reaction of alliances, ultimatums, and mobilizations. The First World War, a mechanized, industrial conflict on an unprecedented scale, ravaged Europe. When the war ended in 1918, 4 major empires had collapsed: the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. In their place, new republics emerged: Weimar Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and a host of Balkan and Baltic states. Many adopted constitutions, held elections, and professed democratic values. It seemed like democracy might finally take root on a global scale. 3. The League of Nations. A new vision for global democracy. In 1920, the victors of WWI established the League of Nations, the first major international organization intended to prevent future wars, promote disarmament, mediate conflicts through diplomacy, foster global cooperation. This was a radical experiment in global governance, rooted in democratic ideals, equality among nations, transparent negotiation, and collective security. But the League was fatally flawed. The United States, despite President Wilson's vision, never joined. It had no enforcement power. It failed to stop aggression in Manchuria, Abyssinia, and Europe. The League's failure became a symbol of democracy's weakness on the world stage. 4. The Great Depression, a crisis of faith in liberal democracy. In 1929, the global economy collapsed. Banks failed, factories closed, unemployment skyrocketed. In Germany, the US, Britain, and elsewhere, millions of people lost faith in democratic governments, which seemed unable to solve the crisis. Into this void stepped authoritarians, men who promised stability, strength, and national renewal. They rejected democratic pluralism as weak and decadent. They blamed minorities, immigrants, and communists for their nation's problems. Democracy, still fragile and often inefficient, struggled to defend itself against fear, hunger, and rage. 5. The rise of fascism, Mussolini and Hitler. In 1922, Benito Mussolini marched on Rome and was appointed prime minister by Italy's king. He quickly dismantled democracy, outlawed opposition parties, censored the press, created a one-party fascist state. Mussolini's Italy became the blueprint for authoritarian populism, promising national greatness while destroying civil liberties. Germany's fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, was beset by hyperinflation, political violence, and humiliation after the Treaty of Versailles. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became chancellor. Within months, he used the Reichstag fire to justify emergency powers, banned opposition parties, created a totalitarian regime. Hitler's Third Reich crushed all dissent and launched a genocidal war across Europe. The democratic experiment in Germany ended in flames. 6. Stalin's Soviet Union, the other authoritarian threat. While fascism spread in the West, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin constructed a different kind of totalitarianism, one born not of nationalism, but of radical communism. Though the USSR proclaimed itself a people's state, in practice it outlawed all political opposition, conducted mass purges and show trials, sent millions to labor camps, controlled the press, education, and industry. Democracy had no place in Stalin's USSR. Power flowed from the top down, enforced by fear and violence. Yet to many in the developing world, the Soviet model, despite its brutality, offered an alternative to Western imperialism. It positioned itself as the champion of the poor and oppressed, drawing global support in the decades to come. 7. Democratic backsliding and collapse. Between 1920 and 1940, democracy suffered its greatest losses in modern history. Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Hungary, and Romania all fell to dictators. In Japan, militarists took control and silenced democratic institutions. Even in the US and UK, fascist sympathizers and demagogues gained traction. The interwar period revealed democracy's deepest vulnerabilities. Economic despair can turn citizens against freedom. Propaganda and fear can manipulate masses. Unchecked executive power can destroy institutions in months. By the late 1930s, only a handful of democracies remained, chiefly the United States, Britain, and the Nordic countries. 8. World War II, the fight for democracy's survival. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. World War II had begun a global war, not just of armies, but of ideologies. The Allies fought for a mix of motives: self-defense, anti-fascism, and for some, democracy. The Axis powers sought empire, racial hierarchy, and authoritarian rule. The war became a test of democracy's endurance. Could democratic societies mobilize, organize, and resist totalitarianism? The answer was yes, but only at tremendous cost. Tens of millions dead, cities in ruins. The Holocaust, which exposed the deepest abyss of authoritarian evil. When the war ended in 1945, the world stood shattered, but hopeful. Democracy had survived, but it would have to reinvent itself to thrive in the post-war era. 9. The United Nations, democracy's new global platform. In 1945, Representatives from 50 nations gathered to form the United Nations, an institution designed to prevent future wars, promote human rights, foster international cooperation. The UN Charter, signed in San Francisco, was a triumph of democratic ideals. All nations are sovereign and equal. War is not a legitimate means of resolving disputes. Human dignity, freedom, and equality must be protected. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights went even further, declaring that all people are entitled to freedom of speech and religion, fair trials, free elections, economic and social rights. While the UN is not a global democracy, it represents the first serious attempt to create a rules-based international order grounded in democratic values. 10. The Cold War begins. Democracy versus communism. Even as the world rebuilt, a new ideological conflict emerged, the Cold War. On one side, the United States and its allies, promoting liberal democracy and capitalism. On the other, the Soviet Union, exporting communism and single-party rule. Both sides claimed to represent the people, but only one allowed free elections, dissent, and pluralism. Over the next 4 decades, this battle for influence would dominate global politics, shaping revolutions, coups, and proxy wars from Latin America to Southeast Asia. In many countries, democracy was manipulated, derailed, or sacrificed in the name of strategic interests. The early 20th century tested democracy like never before. From economic collapse to genocidal regimes, from military dictatorships to ideological showdowns, democracy nearly disappeared. But it didn't. Instead, it adapted. It matured. It learned, sometimes painfully, the importance of institutions, guardrails, and citizen vigilance. In the next chapter, we will explore how after the darkest decades in modern history, democracy staged a remarkable comeback. From the ashes of World War II and the battlefields of decolonization and through the long twilight of the Cold War, democracy would not just survive, it would rise stronger than ever. Part 6. A New World Order. 1. The World Reimagined. Democracy's Second Chance. In 1945, the guns of World War II fell silent. The Axis powers were defeated. The full horror of fascism, genocide, and militarism had been exposed. The world stood at a crossroads. What would the future look like? The answer, for many, was democracy not as it had been, but as it could be. A rebuilt, reimagined, more inclusive form of democracy. One that would offer not just freedom from tyranny, but the promise of dignity, opportunity, and self-determination to all. It was not just about rebuilding buildings, but rebuilding belief that free people, governed by consent, could shape a more just world. This was the beginning of the post-war democratic order, an era of unprecedented global expansion of democratic ideals. 2. The United States and the Western model. Having emerged from World War II as the world's dominant economic and military power, the United States took the lead in promoting democracy abroad. Its system of federal republic, with a constitutionally protected Bill of Rights, separation of powers, and free elections became the blueprint for many aspiring democracies. Key efforts included the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Western Europe's economies and infrastructure to prevent the spread of communism and stabilize democratic governance. NATO, a military alliance built on shared democratic values. The Bretton Woods system, establishing the IMF, World Bank, and later GATT to promote economic interdependence and discourage authoritarian nationalism. But the U.S. model was not without contradictions. Racial segregation and Jim Crow laws undermined claims of moral leadership. CII-backed coups in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile prioritized anti-communism over democratic principles. Domestic turmoil during the civil rights movement revealed deep internal struggles. Still, in a world seeking alternatives to fascism and colonialism, American-style democracy held powerful appeal. 3. Western Europe, from ruins to republics. In Western Europe, democracy rose from the rubble. Germany became the Federal Republic in 1949, adopting a basic law with strong protections for civil liberties and human rights. Its post-Nazi democracy was careful, consensus-driven, and federal. Italy became a republic in 1946, replacing monarchy with a constitution and proportional representation. France, after chaos and occupation, formed the Fifth Republic in 1958, under Charles de Gaulle, balancing parliamentary democracy with a strong executive. In each case, lessons from the past shaped new democratic structures, checks and balances, independent judiciaries, proportional electoral systems, constitutional protections for minorities. The result was a more stable, modernized form of liberal democracy, underpinned by economic cooperation and mutual defense. 4. Japan, democracy from defeat. One of the most remarkable transformations occurred in Japan. After surrendering in 1945, Japan underwent a radical reconstruction under American occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur. The 1947 Constitution renounced war, guaranteed civil liberties, enshrined universal suffrage, made the emperor a symbolic figurehead. Democracy was not indigenous to Japan's feudal and imperial traditions, but within a generation, it took root. Today, Japan is a stable parliamentary democracy, and its post-war experience remains a compelling example of external democratization followed by genuine internal consolidation. 5. Decolonization and the global democratic awakening. From the late 1940s through the 1970s, more than 100 colonies around the world gained independence. This wave of decolonization unleashed a democratic fervor across Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Caribbean. India, in 1947, became the largest democracy in the world, adopting a secular, socialist-leaning constitution that guaranteed rights for all its citizens. Other newly independent nations followed: Ghana, under Kwame Nkrumah, Nigeria, Kenya, Indonesia, Philippines, Sri Lanka, and others. Yet democracy in the global south faced immense challenges: ethnic divisions, often worsened by colonial borders, weak institutions, economic dependency, military coups, and single-party rule. Still, the dream of democracy, of rule by the people for the people, had taken root beyond Europe for the first time in history. 6. The Cold War and democracy's proxy struggles. The post-war era was also the beginning of the Cold War, a bipolar world divided between the US-led capitalist democracies, the Soviet-led communist bloc. In this ideological contest, both sides claimed to speak for the people, but their methods differed radically. The US promoted multi-party elections, free markets, and individual rights. The USSR exported centralized one-party rule, state-controlled economies, and collectivist ideologies. This led to proxy conflicts: Vietnam War, North versus South; Korean War, Democratic South versus Communist North; Cuban Revolution, a communist state 90 miles from Florida; Latin America and Africa, coups, insurgencies, and shifting alliances. Often, democracy was sacrificed for strategic control. Many regimes supported by the West were brutally authoritarian. The moral clarity of democracy was clouded by Cold War realpolitik. 7. Civil rights and social democracy. At home, democracies were undergoing transformations. The question was no longer just about elections, but equality, justice, and inclusion. 7.1 United States, Civil Rights and Reforms. The 1950s-70s saw a civil rights revolution. Brown v. Board of Education ended school segregation. Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination. Voting Rights Act secured the ballot for Black Americans. These weren't just legal reforms, They were democratic corrections, bringing the U.S. closer to its founding promises. 7.2 Europe, the rise of social democracy. In Europe, the post-war consensus led to the rise of social democracy systems that combined political liberalism, economic redistribution, universal health care, education, and welfare. Countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Germany became models of equitable, inclusive democracy. This synthesis of liberty and equality became the gold standard for many across the globe. 8. International institutions and democratic norms. The post-war decades also saw the rise of international institutions that promoted democracy directly or indirectly. The United Nations, the World Bank and IMF, the Council of Europe and European Convention on Human Rights, the European Economic Community. These bodies monitored elections, promoted human rights, sanctioned autocrats, funded development tied to good governance. While critics rightly pointed out Western biases and inconsistencies, the global direction was clear. Democracy was becoming the norm, not the exception. 9. The winds of change in the 1980s. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, democracy was gathering momentum in places where it had long been suppressed. Portugal and Spain transitioned peacefully from dictatorship. Greece returned to civilian rule after a military junta. Latin America, long plagued by coups, began to democratize. Even in the Soviet bloc, cracks were appearing. Solidarity movement in Poland, reformers in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the rise of Gorbachev and talk of glasnost. A historic shift was coming, one that would change the global democratic landscape forever. The post-World War II era was a renaissance for democracy, an age of renewal, expansion, and innovation. Democracy moved beyond the borders of Europe and North America to become a truly global aspiration. It adapted to local cultures. It survived Cold War pressures. It embraced new rights and responsibilities. And just as the century neared its close, democracy was poised to reach its greatest moment yet. A cascade of revolutions that would reshape the world map and bring down the Iron Curtain itself. Part 7. The Many Faces of Modern Democracy. Democracy is not a finished product. It is an evolving, living system shaped by culture, history, and struggle. There is not one democracy, but many. By the late 20th century, democracy had become a global ideal, but also a diverse phenomenon. No longer confined to classical models, it transformed into a spectrum of systems. Some upheld liberal freedoms. Others combined authoritarian traits with electoral rituals. Some embraced grassroots participation. Others centralized control. To understand modern democracy, we must explore its varieties, structures, strengths, and contradictions. 1. The three pillars of modern democracy. While forms vary, most democratic systems share three foundational elements. 1.1 Popular sovereignty. Power originates from the people. Governments are legitimate only if they reflect the will of the citizens. 1.2 Political equality. All citizens, regardless of status, must have equal rights to vote, run for office, and influence policy. 1.3 Rule of law and rights protection. Laws apply equally to all. Freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly are protected, often through constitutions or charters. Yet how these principles are implemented can differ dramatically. 2. Liberal versus illiberal democracy. 2.1 Liberal democracy. This is the model most associated with Western nations. Free, fair, competitive elections, independent judiciary, civil liberties, checks and balances, free press. Countries like Germany, Canada, Sweden, New Zealand, and South Korea are prominent examples. But liberal democracy faces increasing pressure. Rising inequality, political polarization, and mistrust in institutions have sparked doubts even in established democracies. 2.2 illiberal democracy. Coined by Fareed Zakaria, illiberal democracy refers to systems where elections occur, but civil liberties, minority rights, and rule of law are undermined. In such systems, ruling parties dominate media and judiciary. Opposition is allowed, but often harassed or marginalized. Power becomes personalized, despite formal elections. Examples include Hungary under Viktor Orban, Russia under Vladimir Putin, Turkey, where press freedoms and judicial independence have declined. These systems retain the appearance of democracy, but lack its liberal foundations. 3. Presidential versus parliamentary democracies. Another way to classify democracies is by governance structure. 3.1 Presidential systems. Citizens elect both parliament and president. The president serves as both head of state and government. Separation of powers is central. Example: United States, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria. Pros: strong checks and balances, direct mandate. Cons: potential for gridlock, politicized executive. 3.2 Parliamentary systems. Citizens elect a parliament, which then chooses a prime minister. The head of state is symbolic. The executive is accountable to Parliament. Example: United Kingdom, India, Australia, Japan. Pros: more flexible, easier to remove ineffective leaders. Cons: can lead to unstable coalitions or rapid leadership turnover. 3.3 Semi-presidential systems. Blend both models. A president shares power with a prime minister. Example: France, Ukraine, Portugal. This hybrid allows power sharing, but can lead to conflict between president and prime minister if they belong to opposing parties. 4. Electoral systems and their impact. How votes are translated into power matters. Different electoral systems can shape very different democratic outcomes. 4.1 First past the post. The candidate with the most votes wins, even without a majority. Tends to favor two-party systems. Example: US-UK, India. Effect: stable governments but often unrepresentative results. 4.2 Proportional representation. Seats are allocated in proportion to vote share. Encourages multi-party systems, coalitions. Example: Germany, Netherlands, South Africa. Effect: more representative but can lead to fragmented parliaments. 4.3 Ranked choice and mixed systems. Voters rank candidates or vote in two phases. Some countries use mixed systems, combining FPTP and PR. Each system affects who gets elected, how parties behave. Voter engagement. 5. Participatory and deliberative democracy. Modern thinkers increasingly stress active citizen engagement beyond voting. 5.1 Participatory democracy. Encourages direct involvement in decisions through town halls, referendums, citizen assemblies. Examples: Swiss referendums on major policies. Porto Alegre, Brazil pioneered participatory budgeting. Iceland's crowdsourced constitution. 5.2 Deliberative democracy. Focuses on thoughtful discussion, not just majority rule. Involves citizen panels or randomly selected assemblies debating complex issues. Examples: Ireland's Citizens' Assembly. Canada and Belgium have also experimented. These models seek to revive public trust by deepening democracy, making it more inclusive and reflective. 6. Direct democracy in the digital age. Technology is transforming participation. E-voting, online petitions, and digital town halls make engagement easier. Platforms like Paul allow citizens to find consensus across divides. Liquid democracy allows people to delegate votes on specific issues to trusted representatives, creating a fluid balance between direct and representative democracy. However, challenges include security risks, digital divides, manipulation through algorithms, and disinformation. Still, the potential is enormous. A world where democracy is faster, more responsive, and more personalized. 7. Democracy in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Democracy is no longer a Western project. Its most dynamic evolution is now seen in the global South. 7.1 Asia. India remains a robust democracy with over 900 million voters. Indonesia transformed after Suharto's fall in 1998 into a thriving democracy. Taiwan emerged as a digital democratic pioneer. South Korea, once authoritarian, now has a vibrant civil society and political pluralism. Yet challenges remain notably in Thailand, frequent coups. Myanmar, military rollback of democracy. China, one-party state with consultative elements but no elections. 7.2 Africa. In the 1990s, a wave of democratization swept Africa. South Africa transitioned peacefully in 1994, ending apartheid. Ghana, Botswana, Senegal, and Namibia are models of stability. However, some democracies face backsliding. Military coups returned in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Yet the demand for democracy remains powerful, particularly among youth and civil movements. 7.3 Latin America. After decades of dictatorship, countries like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil embraced democratic rule in the 1980s-90s. Elections, media pluralism, and social movements are now widespread. Still, corruption and inequality remain deep challenges. Populism and authoritarian nostalgia persist. 8. Multi-level and supranational democracy. Democracy has also gone beyond the nation-state. 8.1 European Union. A unique experiment in supranational democracy. A directly elected European Parliament. Charter of Fundamental Rights. Participatory tools like the European Citizens' Initiative. Critics argue the EU suffers from a democratic deficit, but its institutions represent a bold step in global governance. 8.2 Local democracy. Cities are increasingly laboratories of democratic innovation, from participatory budgeting to smart governance. Mayors of major cities often outpace national governments in engaging citizens and solving problems. Modern democracy is not a monolith, it is a mosaic of traditions, experiments, and adaptations. From liberal to illiberal, presidential to parliamentary, representative to direct, democracy exists in myriad forms, each shaped by culture, conflict, and context. But despite this diversity, one thread binds them all: the unrelenting desire of people to be heard, respected, and empowered. From the crowded agoras of ancient Athens to the flickering glow of smartphone screens on election night, the story of democracy has never been static. It has bled, breathed, broken, and reborn. Across millennia, it has stood not as a perfect system, but as humanity's most enduring experiment in freedom, dignity, and shared power. We have seen how democracy began with city-states and village councils, rose and fell with empires, was reborn in revolutions, tested in wars, and stretched across continents. It has been twisted by tyrants and restored by movements. It has adapted to technology, culture, and crisis. And yet, for all its triumphs, democracy remains deeply fragile. In an age where algorithms shape opinions, where truth competes with spectacle, and where autocrats cloak themselves in ballots, democracy faces new kinds of enemies, some from without, many from within. Complacency, corruption, disinformation, and division, these are the modern plagues it must survive. But history offers a lesson louder than any fear. Democracy endures not because it is easy, but because it is demanded. It is reborn each time a citizen casts a vote, each time a whistleblower speaks truth, each time a journalist risks silence, each time a young voice asks, "Why not better?" It is forged in courts, classrooms, and coffee shops, in protests and petitions, in poetry and in code. Democracy does not belong to politicians. It belongs to you. And its future will not be written by fate, but by participation. Thank you for joining this journey through time. If you found this deep dive into democracy enlightening and thought-provoking, we invite you to subscribe to this channel for more long-form explorations into history, philosophy, and the forces shaping our world. Comment below with your thoughts. What does democracy mean to you? Where do you think it's heading? Like and share this video if you believe in the power of informed citizens and timeless ideas. Your voice is not just welcome, it's essential. Because in the grand story of democracy, the next chapter is always unwritten, and it belongs to all of us.